The morning on Oak Island was quiet in a way that felt unusual, almost heavy, as if the ground itself understood that something important was about to happen. The sky was still pale, the sun not fully risen, and the cold air moved slowly across the field. Most of the team was tired after long days, long nights, and endless planning, but there was something different in the air, something that none of them could name, but all of them could feel. Standing near the edge of the money pit, Marty looked down into the area where the final stage of digging for the season had been planned. His face, normally steady and thoughtful, showed something more complicated on this morning. A mix of worry, exhaustion, and something even deeper that he rarely let show. He had spent many years pushing forward, making practical decisions, balancing the dream of discovery with the reality of danger. But on this day, he stood still, watching the team move around him with a feeling he could not shake. For 12 long seasons, Marty had faced countless problems on the island. Weather that ruined plans, tunnels that collapsed, false leads that wasted time, and old stories that seemed to grow heavier each year they chased them. But nothing had ever made him stop. Nothing had ever made him step away. He always found a reason to keep going, to support the team, to stand beside his brother. But the day ahead would test him in a way he had never expected, and the events that followed would leave him shaken, troubled, and forced to make a choice that would change the future of Oak Island forever. The garden shaft was the center of everyone's focus this season. Many believed it might be the direct route to the original money pit, something people had searched for since the 1700s. The team had used the most advanced tools they could get, drilling equipment that could cut through deep layers of clay, rock, and old timber. They had studied maps, charts, old records, and new scans. Everything pointed to something unusual deep underground. A large metallic shape had appeared on the scans, over 160 feet down. It was solid, it was large, and it did not match anything natural. That alone was enough to send excitement through the entire team. But what most people did not know was that the readings around the object came with strange signal spikes, energy shifts that no one could explain. The geologists who checked the results were confused, unsure whether their tools were malfunctioning or whether something truly unusual lay beneath the surface. Even Marty, who always kept a steady mind, could feel that something different was happening. He had said many times that Oak Island often tricked people, that the ground was filled with old shafts, tons of debris, and a long history of failed attempts. But even he couldn't ignore the strength of the new evidence. Every detail seemed to lead toward a discovery greater than any they had imagined. On the final day of digging, everyone gathered around the garden shaft. The production crew set up cameras, microphones, and lights. The drill team checked the large steel casing that would be lowered into the ground. It was 10 feet wide, strong enough to keep the walls from collapsing so they could send down a camera or even a diver. The plan was simple enough, but the tension in the air made it feel far more serious. Some members of the team whispered quietly to each other, unsure if they were more excited or nervous. Others stood with their hands in their pockets trying to stay calm. Marty moved between the equipment and the crew, checking every detail. He wanted to avoid mistakes, avoid danger, avoid anything that could harm the team. Rick stood close by, his eyes filled with the same hope he had carried since he first stepped foot on the island many years before. For Rick, this moment was the closest he had ever been to finding the truth. His heart was full of belief.
The dreams came with risks, and he felt those risks more heavily than ever today. When the drill started, the air filled with vibration. The large metal tube spun slowly at first, then faster, chewing through the earth inch by inch. The ground shook slightly under everyone's feet. The monitor in the war room displayed the depth as the drill moved closer to the metallic object they had identified. Every person watched closely. Every foot down felt like another step toward a truth that had waited underground for centuries. At 100 feet, the team held their breath. At 120 feet, the sound of the drill grew sharper. At 150 feet, tension spread across the room. When the drill reached 158 feet, everything changed. The machine hit something that pushed back so hard the drill nearly stopped. The sound echoed across the island, a harsh, grinding noise that didn't match anything they had encountered before. It didn't feel like rock. It didn't feel like wood. It felt like something solid, something built, something that did not want to be disturbed. The operators tried to steady the drill. Marty grabbed the radio and told them to slow down, to ease off the pressure. Rick, pale but determined, told them to keep going. For a moment, no one knew who to listen to. The drill screamed as if it were being forced into something unnatural. Then, with one sudden crack, the resistance gave way. The drill broke through. And that was when things on the island shifted from strange to unbelievable. A deep hum rose from below the island. It was not mechanical. It was not an echo from the drill. It was something older, something powerful, something that felt alive. The vibration spread through the ground and up through the air, shaking the walls of the war room. The lights flickered. The screens showing the camera feed from the drill went black. People shouted, unsure what was happening. Then the hum grew louder, clearer, almost like a pulse. That was when the blue light appeared. It rose from the bottom of the garden shaft, glowing brighter and brighter until it washed over the equipment. It filled the air with a soft, almost shimmering color that did not seem natural. Even in daylight, the glow was strong enough to be seen clearly. The team stared at it with wide eyes, unable to move. No one had ever seen anything like it. The glow lasted for half a minute and then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Silence fell over the area. It was so quiet that even breathing seemed loud. Rick grabbed the radio and called for the camera systems to be restarted. He wanted to see what the drill had broken into. But as he spoke, Marty took a step back. His face had lost all color. His eyes were filled with fear. Not confusion, not worry, fear. He moved away from the shaft slowly, watching the ground as if expecting something to rise out of it. Before anyone could react, engines roared across the causeway. Several black SUVs, the kind that looked official but had no markings, approached at high speed. The doors opened, and a group of men in dark suits stepped out. They didn't look like police. They didn't look like locals. They moved with a firm, practiced precision.
Approached the team with no hesitation, forming a controlled perimeter around the garden shaft. One of them walked up to Rick and Marty. His voice was calm, but his words were cold. This site is now under federal control. Your operation is over. There was no paperwork shown, no explanation given. The agents demanded all camera footage from the last hour. Crew members were forced to hand over their equipment. Some tried to argue, but the agents' stern faces and firm postures left no room for discussion. They were armed, they were serious, and they clearly knew something the team did not. Rick looked stunned. Marty stepped further away, his mind racing, his fear growing. Something about this moment felt wrong, dangerously wrong. The island had a long history of mysteries and stories, but nothing had prepared him for this. And this moment marked the beginning of the decision that would break the partnership and change the future of Oak Island forever. Marty walked away from the argument, but the sound of his footsteps felt heavier than anything that had happened that day. Rick stayed frozen in place, unable to believe what he had just heard. The cold air of the island felt even colder now. It wasn't because of the weather. It was because something deep inside him suddenly felt empty. For years, he had leaned on Marty in more ways than he ever admitted. Marty was the one who asked the hard questions. Marty was the one who made sure every risk was measured. Marty was the one who kept the search grounded in reality. Without him, Rick now felt like a man standing on the edge of a cliff with no one beside him. Meanwhile, word spread quietly among the crew that something serious had happened between the brothers. No one dared to ask. No one wanted to get too close to the government agents who stood like stone statues around the site. Their faces showed no emotion, their stance never changed, and they never took their eyes off the garden shaft. It was clear they were not there for treasure. They were there for whatever had been disturbed deep underground. As the hours passed, the atmosphere around the island became heavier and more tense. The wind moved across the trees, but the usual sounds of work, machines, voices, trucks, were gone. Everything had stopped. It felt like the whole island was holding its breath. Some crew members whispered theories among themselves, wondering if they had dug into something radioactive or something ancient or something that simply should not have been touched. Others kept their thoughts to themselves, terrified of saying the wrong thing within earshot of the men in black suits. Rick finally made his way back toward the war room. Every step felt slower than the last. He kept replaying Marty's words in his mind. The idea of Marty leaving was painful enough, but the idea that Marty had resigned because he believed the danger was real made Rick's stomach twist. For Rick, the search had always been a matter of destiny. For Marty, it had always been a matter of logic and caution. When logic gave up, that meant something was deeply wrong. Inside the war room, the monitors were still dark and the equipment was still offline. Some technicians were trying to repair the systems, but even they looked nervous. One of them walked up to Rick and quietly said that some parts were beyond repair.
Of the recorded footage were missing, completely wiped. Not corrupted, deleted. This meant someone had already pulled the files from the main system, and no one on the team had done it. Rick didn't respond. He just nodded and sat down in his chair. For the first time in years, the room felt empty despite being full of people. Everyone seemed to be waiting for Rick to say something, but the truth was, Rick didn't know what to say. All he could think about was the strange blue glow, the deep humming sound, the vibration that shook the earth, and the way those government vehicles arrived almost immediately afterward. He had seen many strange things on Oak Island over the years, but this was something different. This felt alive. Rick tried to collect himself and think clearly. He wanted answers. He needed to know what the drill had broken into. But every possible explanation felt too big to understand. Part of him wanted to run back to the shaft and look for himself. Another part felt frozen, unsure of what he would find. If something powerful had been buried for centuries, maybe even longer, then disturbing it might have been a mistake no one could undo. As the sun dropped lower in the sky, casting a long orange glow over the island, Rick stepped outside. He needed air. He needed space to gather his thoughts. The entire causeway now had barricades set up by the agents. They were taking the situation far more seriously than anyone expected. Some of the agents spoke quietly into radios. Others simply stood guard, watching everything and everyone. The whole scene looked like a restricted military zone, not a treasure site. Rick walked toward the shoreline and stopped, staring across the water. Oak Island had always been a place full of hidden history, ancient structures, and mysterious clues. But now he wondered if it had been hiding more than treasure. Maybe the legends about the island had always been true. Maybe the stories about curses and secret nights were only the surface of something far more complicated. Rick thought about the strange energy readings from earlier in the season. The team had joked about them. Even experts couldn't explain the weird spikes in the data. Perhaps those readings were warnings, signals of something dangerous buried deep below. And when the drill finally broke through, whatever was down there reacted. The blue glow replayed in Rick's mind again and again. It wasn't like any light he had ever seen. Bright but soft. Calm but powerful. It didn't flicker like electricity or burn like fire. It pulsed, almost like a heartbeat. And the vibrations felt like something waking up. This thought sent a chill through his body. What if they had awakened something that was never meant to be touched? What if the island wasn't protecting treasure, but containing something? As Rick stood there, lost in thought,
One of the government agents approached him. The man's steps were slow and deliberate. His expression did not change. He stopped a few feet away from Rick and spoke in a low voice that carried a tone of control and finality. "We need to ask you some questions," he said. Rick nodded silently. The agent asked about the drill depth, the exact moment the anomaly was breached, and whether the team had recovered any physical object before the shutdown. Rick answered honestly, but he also watched the agent closely. The man's face didn't reveal anything, but his eyes were sharp, watching every reaction Rick had. Then the agent asked the question that stunned Rick. When the light appeared, did anyone feel a pressure change or hear anything unusual? Rick froze. He hadn't mentioned the vibration. He hadn't mentioned the hum that rolled across the island like a giant tuning fork. So how did the agent know? Rick realized then that these men didn't just arrive fast. They arrived prepared. They already knew what kind of reaction the anomaly could produce. That meant they weren't just investigating. They were expecting it. Rick answered, trying to stay calm. But deep down, fear began spreading through him. Not fear of the unknown, but fear of the idea that the unknown was known by someone else. Someone who had kept it secret. The agent nodded, thanked him, and walked away without another word. Rick stayed where he was for several minutes, trying to understand what any of it meant. The sky was growing darker, and the cold wind brushed past him like a warning. Everything inside him felt tangled. He wanted Marty by his side more than anything. They had faced storms, floods, traps, collapses, lost data, unexpected failures, everything a treasure hunt could throw at them. But this was different. This was not just a discovery. It was a turning point. It was a moment that changed the entire meaning of the search. Suddenly, Rick heard footsteps approaching behind him. He turned, half expecting to see an agent again, but instead it was one of the longest-serving crew members. His face looked pale and shaken. He said he had something Rick needed to see. Rick followed him toward one of the trailers where the crew stored backups of footage and raw data. But before they even entered, the man whispered that something strange had happened inside. When they opened the door, Rick saw it clearly. The backup system had been stripped clean. Every drive, every copy of the footage, every recording from the drilling operation. Gone. Not damaged, not hidden, removed. This was not an accident. It was a sweep. Someone wanted every trace of the event erased. Rick felt his heart drop. It was not just a physical
discovery that had been taken from them. It was their story, their proof, their evidence. And in that moment, Rick understood why Marty had been so afraid. This was no longer a hunt. This was a cover-up, and Rick was standing in the middle of it. Rick stood inside the trailer, staring at the empty shelves where the backup drives had been only hours before. He felt a hollow feeling grow in his chest. The crew member beside him kept glancing nervously over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to burst in at any moment. The whole room smelled like dust and cold metal, but there was something else too, something heavier. It felt like the quiet after a storm, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Rick stepped closer to one of the metal racks and ran his hand along it. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no scattered cables. Whoever had come in hadn't rushed. They had worked slowly, calmly, and most of all, confidently. They knew no one would stop them. They knew no one would dare. Rick turned to the crew member and asked who had been near the trailer earlier. The man shook his head and said no one had been allowed near the area except the agents. They had sealed off the entire location, then said it was to keep the team safe. Now it was clear the real reason was to give them full control. Rick thanked him and stepped outside. The sky had grown darker now, with deep purple clouds gathering over the trees. A cold wind pushed across the island, carrying the smell of the sea. The lights from the garden shaft area still glowed brightly, but not a single machine was running. It looked like a crime scene more than a dig site. Rick started walking back toward the causeway, trying to clear his mind. But the more he thought about everything, the more the pieces lined up in a way that made his stomach tighten. The strange energy readings, the pulsing blue light, the vibration in the ground, the sudden blackout of their cameras, the immediate arrival of armed agents, and now the erasing of all evidence. It was not random. It was not coincidence. Someone had been watching them. Someone who already knew the island held something powerful, something that should never have been found. And once the team brushed close enough to uncover it, the ones watching stepped in and took control. Rick reached the end of the causeway, where two agents stood guarding the road. Their faces were unreadable, their eyes following every movement he made. Rick wondered how much they knew. Did they know what had been down there? Did they know who built the tunnels? Did they know what the blue light was? He walked past them without a word. They didn't stop him, but their silence made his skin crawl. It felt like walking past its statues carved to intimidate. Halfway across the causeway, Rick stopped and looked back at the island. For the first time in his life, he felt like an outsider on the island he loved more than anything. It no longer felt like a place of hope. It felt like a place of secrets that were meant to remain buried. Rick wiped his face, trying to stay strong. His mind drifted back to Marty. They had spent more than a decade working together, dreaming together, and fighting through every setback. But now, they were standing on opposite sides of this moment. Marty had seen the danger clearly. Rick had seen the purpose. And that difference now threatened to break their entire partnership apart. When Rick reached the end of the causeway, he found Marty standing alone beside one of the trucks. He looked tired, more tired than Rick had ever seen him. His arms were crossed, and he stared at the ground as if trying to make sense of everything. Rick walked toward him slowly. The wind whipped between them, carrying bits of dust and leaves across the road. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was heavy and painful, a silence built from years of trust now broken in one terrifying afternoon. Finally, Marty looked up. His eyes were red, like he hadn't blinked for minutes. "You saw what they did?" he asked in a low voice. Rick nodded. "They took everything," Marty continued. "All our footage, all our data. It's gone. They made sure we have nothing left." Rick didn't respond. He knew Marty wasn't asking for answers. He was letting out the frustration they both felt. Marty stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. "Rick, this isn't about treasure anymore. It isn't about tunnels or maps or history. It's about power. We touched something we weren't supposed to touch, and they knew. They were waiting." Rick felt a sharp pain in his chest. Marty was right. Everything pointed to the same truth. This was bigger than the island, bigger than their dream, maybe even bigger than any legend they had ever heard. But Rick still wasn't ready to let go. "Marty," Rick said quietly, "we can't stop now. Not when we're this close." Marty's expression hardened. He shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. If we keep going, we're not just risking money or equipment, we're risking our lives. Think about those men. They're not treasure hunters, they're not archaeologists. They're from somewhere higher, and if they're willing to shut down a whole operation in minutes, what else would they do?" Rick looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly. He tried to hide it, but Marty noticed. Without saying a word, Marty placed a hand on Rick's shoulder. "I'm scared for you," Marty said, his voice cracking.